All right, well, in this next video, we're going to continue to look at the context and the setting of the book of Habakkuk, but we're actually going to get into the text here, the first few verses of this book. Now, when you're thinking about the context, it's very important to understand two aspects of the setting for this book. The first aspect is the historical setting. Let's look at that first. The book of Habakkuk was written around 600 BC during what is called the divided kingdom of Israel, so 600 years before Jesus came. Now, maybe some of you aren't familiar with that term divided kingdom. Let me kind of give you a brief history of the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. This might sound a little overwhelming, but it's important to understand this, to understand where this book comes in its proper historical setting. So here's a brief history of Israel. The nation started way back in about 1800 or so BC when God called the patriarch Abraham to follow after him and start this new nation. And Abraham went on to be the first of several patriarchs who would lead the nation, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so forth, and these were these very important initial leaders of Israel. But after a while, a few hundred years or so, a new type of leader came to be in charge of Israel, and they were people called judges. And these were people like Samson and Deborah, who were some of the famous judges who led the nation of Israel from about 1500 BC to about 1025 BC. Now, everything went, for the most part, pretty good. There were these cycles of rebellion and blessing while they're under the judges, but after a while, the people of Israel clamored and they said, "We want a king." And God warned them that this wouldn't be good for their nation, but they said, "No, we want that all the other nations around us have kings. That's what we want too." So ultimately, God gave them that request, and in 1025, the nation of Israel became a monarchy where they were united as a single kingdom under a single king. And the first king was a guy named King Saul, and he turned out to be a very bad guy. And then following him was a guy named King David, who was a really good king. And then following King David was King Solomon, who was kind of a tweener. He was kind of half good, half bad. And so under those three kings, they were a united kingdom, a monarchy, and that lasted for about 100 years or so. But after a while, under King Solomon, things started to deteriorate in the nation. They couldn't get along. There was a lot of backfighting and conflict, and so ultimately they divided into two separate kingdoms. And the once united kingdom became divided into these two kingdoms. One was called Israel in the north. That was composed of 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the southern kingdom was called Judah, and that was composed of the other 10 tribes of Israel. And so now this once united nation is living as two separate kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Now, that's important to know because this book is written during this divided kingdom, and it's written to the people in the south, the people of Judah. That's who Habakkuk is writing. So that's important to understand, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Now, after a while, the nation was allowed to ultimately be reunited as one nation in Jerusalem again, but not quite with the same power they had before. You see, what happened was the northern kingdom went on till about 722 BC, where they were ultimately conquered by the Assyrians, and the southern kingdom, to whom the book of Habakkuk is written, was conquered very soon after this book was written by the nation of Babylon. Now, Babylon also went on to conquer Assyria and sort of absorb them into their nation. But then Babylon was ultimately conquered by the Persians, and it was the Persians under Cyrus who allowed Israel to return to Jerusalem and be reunited again as a nation. So that's kind of a brief history of the nation of Israel, and again, this book fits in there during that divided kingdom period. And here's verse 1. It simply says this: the prophecy that Habakkuk, the prophet, received. And so what we learn is that this guy named Habakkuk was a prophet, and again, he was a prophet to the southern kingdom of Israel at the time. Now, one other thing, it's important to know that this book is written right on the cusp of Babylon really beginning to strengthen and become very powerful, and they're just about to close in on Judah, the southern kingdom. And so you see here, this was written right around 600 or so BC, and they were conquered just a few years after this book was written. So that's kind of the historical context of what is going on here. Now, another Another very important context to understand is the spiritual setting. What is the spiritual context? Now, what was interesting is that people had seen what had happened to the northern kingdom of Israel, how they fell into spiritual laxity and then ultimately were conquered by the Assyrians, but it didn't seem to faze them very much in the south. You would hope that they would kind of take notice of what happened to their people up north, but they ignored that, and so very soon they became victims of the same experience. And the reason why is because their culture became just full of violence and corruption. They increasingly were rebelling against God. Here's how Habakkuk describes this in verses 2 through 4 of this book. He cries out to God and he says, "How long, Lord, must I call for help, but you don't listen?" We'll talk about that more in a minute, but he's looking around his culture and he's saying, "I cry out to you, violence, but you do not save. Why do you make me look at this injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are before me. There's strife and conflict abounds. Therefore the law is paralyzed and justice never prevails. The wicked hem in the righteous so that justice is perverted." So Habakkuk here is crying out to God, and just think about this scene he is describing. It is not good. There is violence and injustice and wrongdoing. There's conflict. Justice never prevails, and the wicked outnumber the righteous. And so it's a very bad setting for the people of Israel. They're in a very difficult spiritual place because they had allowed sin to completely corrupt them. Now, one other aspect of their spiritual setting is, though they were full of sin, as a people, they still consider themselves religious. They still consider themselves followers of God. They just didn't live like it very much. And so they had seen the pattern of sin play out before them, and now they were living out that same pattern where they were falling farther and farther into sin, but they were kind of, as we said in the last video, spiritually complacent and apathetic about it and didn't seem to really care. And that's going to set up this whole book. Now, here's a couple things for you to think about as you think about these first couple verses. Why is it that people, when they can see and they know the results and the consequences of sin, why do they continue to do it? Just like the people of Judah, they saw what happened to Israel, yet they continued in the same pattern. And what about you? Where do you see some of those results of sin in your own life personally and maybe around you in the world today? I think it's important to understand that as we begin to look at this book.